Good evening and welcome to our series of commentary on our daily prayers. In the past, we've covered what we can consider to be Judaism's most essential prayer, the Shemona Esrei, the 18 benedictions. We went through all of the various benedictions. Total, actually, is 19. And now we're going to go right back to the beginning of the prayer book. The very first prayer that a Jew says as soon as he wakes up in the morning, he's barely conscious, hasn't done anything, hasn't washed his hands or her hands, hasn't taken care of one's hygienic needs. Just the first moment of consciousness and awareness, we wake up and we say a very short prayer known as the Moda Ani prayer. Prayer reads, Moda Ani lefanecha, I offer thanks to you, Melech Chai v'Kayam, the living and eternal King, Shehechzarta bi nishmasi v'chemla, for having compassionately restored my soul within me. Rabba emunasecha, great is your faithfulness. This very short prayer is first and foremost an expression of gratitude. The very first word of the prayer, modeh, for those who are familiar with Hebrew, the word todah, todah rabbah, thank you very much. Know that that word implies gratitude. And the very first thing we do when we wake up in the morning is we show gratitude to God, as we just said, for having restored our soul within us. So, at the very least, we are thanking God for being alive. And as soon as you wake up, you have to make that acknowledgement. Why can't you wait till later? Because in Jewish law, there's a principle, and this principle is not just a legal matter, but it's also a matter of sensitivity. That whenever you experience a benefit in this world, you have to show gratitude to God. For example, we're about to eat an apple, so the apple is about to be bitten into. You have to recite a blessing to thank God for that apple. And as soon as you thank God, you bite into the apple. You can't then just have a discussion and say, well, I thanked God. You thank Him as soon as you have that benefit. You cannot thank Him afterwards, although there is an after blessing. If you eat a certain amount of the apple, you'd say a blessing to thank God for the past. But soon as you are ready for that benefit, and as soon as you experience the benefit, you have to show gratitude. You cannot delay it. That's not just a law, but it expresses real sensitivity, because the things that are important to us, we do without delay. What we procrastinate about, what we find ways of postponing it for the next day, are the things that are only of secondary importance to us. Gratitude in Judaism is of paramount importance, and it expresses itself not just in this prayer, but throughout our prayers. We're going to have a prayer that begins one part of our daily service, and that prayer is called Hodu, Hodu Hashem, give thanks to God. In the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei that I referred to before, we say Modim Anachnolach. We thank you. We gratefully show appreciation to you. And throughout our prayers, the term of gratitude is found in various ways and various forms. But the very first time we express gratitude is when we wake up in the morning. And it's also interesting that in Hebrew syntax, there could be two ways of saying the same thing. You could say Moda Ani, as we do say, or we could say Ani Modeh. Either way, it means in English, I offer thanks to you. But in English, notice, it's translated as I offer thanks to you. If I translate the Hebrew word for word, it would read, thanks I to you. English doesn't work. But in Hebrew syntax, you can do it either way. The fact you can do it either way means that there are differences between the two ways. If I say, I thank you, what is the center of attention? The I. I am here. I am the first and foremost entity in this expression of gratitude, but I am willing to acknowledge that you also exist. So I am thanking you. In the Hebrew, the way it appears here, although it could have been phrased that way, ani modeh, but we say modeh ani, thanks to you. The gratitude comes before the I. That means that the first feeling has to be one of overwhelming gratitude that you are alive and expressing the gratitude to God. Now, why are we thanking God? Well, of course, because we're alive. But as a Jew, there's more to it than just being alive. Because when a person sleeps, what happens to the dynamic of soul and body and their relationship and interplay? When we're asleep, we're obviously still alive, but we're not in a state of consciousness. Translated into spiritual terminology, that means that the soul partially leaves the body and the soul goes on a journey. The soul travels from this physical existence into a spiritual realm and reality. If the soul is worthy, it enters into Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, the spiritual parallel to the Garden of Eden, paradise, and it absorbs the energy of Torah that is being studied on a spiritual level in paradise. And the soul is thus given new energy, new spiritual energy. So when you wake up in the morning, you're not just refreshed and ready to take on the day physically, but their soul is now newly energized. So it's a great thing for the soul. But while you're asleep, there's a problem for the body. The body doesn't have the ability to accomplish anything because it's asleep. The body, according to Jewish tradition and Jewish law, acquires a state of tumah, of impurity, ritual impurity, not dirt. Impurity means a state in which its overt expression of godly energy is diminished. You don't see godly energy, you see it in life. Sleep, which is, in the words of the Talmud and the Zohar, 1/60th of death, is a curtailment of life and hence a diminution of godly presence. So that's not good for the body. For the soul, it's great. The soul goes to a higher place. But the body is bereft of its full capacity to experience the higher things in life, let alone its ability to think rationally. We have dreams and nightmares when we're asleep. So sleep could be a debilitating process for the body because its separation from the soul occurs at night. So when we wake up in the morning, we're saying not only we're alive, but we now have the potential to fulfill the mission for which the soul has been put into this world in the first place. True, the soul needs to be rejuvenated, just like the body has to go through a resting period, but its rejuvenation is waiting to produce results until we wake up in the morning. And then we say, wow, we now have our soul's rejuvenated energy that can give us the ability to take on the day in more than one way. There's a biblical verse in the book of Numbers which talks about the tithing of our produce. One of the requirements is that when we make dough, when we knead dough, knead with a K here, dough as in batter, flour and water mixed together. When we knead dough, it says, Reishis arisosechem, the first of your dough, titnu Hashem, you must give to God. And that is fulfilled by taking a piece of the dough, and in the olden days, we would give it to a Kohen, God's servant. Now we take it and we burn it. Well, there's a Hasidic reinterpretation of that verse. The Hebrew word for dough, ariso sechem, which means your dough, could also be translated as your cradle or your bed. Arisa is a bed. That the first thing upon awakening from bed you give to God, which tells us a little bit more about what Modani is. Modani is not just saying thank you, God. It's about starting the day, which is the richest part of the day in a certain sense. When we first wake up and our life is restored, that first part of the day, we say, doesn't belong to us. It belongs to God. We allow God to be the one to whom we dedicate that first part of our day. What does Modani accomplish? Before we go into deeper levels of Modani, Modani, by virtue of this awareness and this recognition of God and the expression of gratitude to Him, affects the rest of the day. Every part of the day is regulated, you could say, by the first thing that we do during the day. If you start your day on a miserable, negative note, it can have a negative effect on your whole day. Of course, we always have free choice and we can always turn things around one way or the other, but the energy that we get at the beginning of the day says a lot about how the rest of our day will follow. So when you start the day with Modani, it affects the entire day. The Rebbe takes this a step further. The Rebbe points to a apparent contradiction. When a person transgresses, when a person commits a crime, but he didn't really intend to do it, then it doesn't count as a crime according to many opinions. That means that when there's a lack of intent, it's considered as if you didn't do it. For example, Talmud uses this example in the laws of the Shabbos. We're not allowed to dig ditches on Shabbos. But what happens if you're in the backyard and you have a lawn chair? It's not a very heavy chair. You can lift it up easily, but you decided to drag it, and while you're dragging it, it digs a groove in the ground, which would be forbidden if you intended to make that groove. But because you didn't intend to do it, you're not in violation of the Shabbos restriction of work, one of which is digging a groove, because it's considered to be either building or plowing, depending on various circumstances and conditions. That means a lack of kavanah, a lack of intent and concentration, renders the act to be a non-act, at least in terms of a prohibition. Now, let's turn to a mitzvah. You do a mitzvah without intent. You're not thinking about the mitzvah, you just do it. According to many opinions, mitzvos ein tzrichos kavana. To fulfill a mitzvah, you don't need intent. Just the act of the mitzvah itself is enough. You eat matzah on Pesach thinking that it's matzah. You don't realize it's Pesach. You don't realize that it's a mitzvah. You didn't intend to fulfill the mitzvah. You still get the credit for the mitzvah. And likewise with other mitzvahs. So the Rebbe's question is, if lack of intent renders an act of a transgression null and void, then how could the mitzvah be a mitzvah without intent? And the Rebbe establishes a very powerful concept. He says, there is no such thing as a mitzvah without intent. Because if a Jew wakes up in the morning and says Moda Ani and acknowledges his connection to God and awareness of God, that serves as the intent for every subsequent mitzvah that a Jew will do throughout the day. And the Rebbe gives an analogy in the laws of marriage. If you give a woman a ring and you tell her you're betrothing her, marrying her with that ring, and she's of course married, of course there has to be witnesses and so on and so forth. We're not going into the laws of marriage. But what happens if a man was discussing marriage with a woman, and after discussing it, he gives her a ring? Now, he was discussing marriage, but he never really said to her those words, I'm marrying you with this ring. But the fact that they were discussing it, and then after the discussion, he gives her the ring, that discussion suffices for the act that follows and comes later. Be that as it may, according to the Rebbe's thesis, the fact that you say Moda Ani in the morning gives life and soul to every good thing that you do throughout the day. That's how important saying Moda Ani is. But there's something anomalous about Moda Ani. If it's such a holy prayer, if it's so powerful, it changes your whole day, and you're expressing gratitude to whom? To God. If you look through the Moda Ani, God's name is not mentioned even once. We allude to God, of course. We say, I offer thanks to you, living and eternal King. Who's that? Of course, God. But we never use the term God. And there are many terms that our prayers employ for God. The Tetragrammaton, the Aleph, Dalet, Nun, Yud, Elohim, various names that we do not use in this prayer. Why? Why don't we use God's name? So the answer is that, in truth, there is another prayer that was composed to offer thanks to God, in which God's name is mentioned. That's a prayer starting with the words Elokai, Neshama Shanasatapi, my God, the soul that you place within me is pure, and you go on to describing the soul and how we're grateful to God, and we say the words Moda Ani Lefanecha in that prayer as well. That prayer was originally the one that was said in the morning that does include God's name. But for reasons that I'll soon explain, a shorter version of it without God's name was replaced the longer version. And the reason for that is that we're not allowed to say God's name when our hands are not clean. And therefore, since when we're sleeping, we're not aware of where our hands that were and what they were touching, maybe they were touching a part of our body that isn't clean, we are not allowed to say God's name. That's why this prayer leaves God's name out. A little bit later, we'll see that there's a deeper understanding of that the lack of God's name is not that this prayer is inferior to other prayers, it's superior to it. Is it disconnected? The Moda Ani, is it disconnected? We had a little mishap here, and we're back again. The Moda Ani, in which we express gratitude, can be understood on 4 levels. Torah in general, every aspect of Torah, can be interpreted in myriads of levels. But there are generally, we refer to 4 different levels known as pardes. Pardes literally means an orchard, because Torah study is like going into an orchard of delicacies and delights. And as we go from level to level, we go deeper into that pleasure of Torah study. The first level, the P of Pardes, stands for Pshat, the simple, straightforward meaning of a text. For example, if the text says, God said, let there be light, it means God said, let there be light. But then the same text could have a remez, a hint to some other concept. We could say God said, let there be light, but it may be referring to some other kind of light other than the light that God created on the first day of creation. Then that's the R of Pardes. Then there's the D, standing for Drush. Drush means investigative, that which we do to probe beneath the surface. What is the deeper meaning of light that gives us a message beyond the simple meaning and the alluded meaning? And then there's the S of Pardes, standing for Sod, which means secret. Then there's the mystical, secret dimension of the Torah that deals with godly attributes and energies that are embedded in that text. So the Rebbe, in a landmark discourse called On the Essence of Chassidus, explains the Modani on all four levels. So the first level of Pshat is straightforward, very simple, and we already explained that we're grateful to God for having given us life again. We go to sleep at night, we retire our soul, the soul leaves the body to some extent. In the morning we wake up, refreshed, invigorated, and God therefore needs to be thanked for that restoration of our soul. That is straightforward. Then we have the second level, which is the remez, the hint. What is the hint? Whenever we talk about hints, most people think of the concept of gematria, the numerical value. If we have one word, like the word or, light, adds up to 207, and the word raz, which means secret, is also 207. Therefore, the word or, light, alludes to the idea of secret, of the mystical secret energy. That's where we use remez through gematria, or sometimes a word could be an acronym. Sometimes a sentence could be consolidated into one word, and all sorts of allusions and ways of showing associations between one word, one phrase, and another. The Rebbe uses the concept of remez in a deeper way, in a different way, that sometimes a text is saying one thing, but if you take the concept, you could apply it to something remote, just like a remez is a hint. For example, if someone is talking and you snap your fingers as a gesture to have them stop talking, the gesture of snapping a finger is totally unrelated to talking or not talking, but it's a hint. So the same way we can look at a text and look at how it alludes to something remote. And what is the remote relationship to Modani? So the Rebbe explains that is the resurrection of the dead, one of the 13 principles of faith. Maimonides enumerated 13 principles that a Jew must believe in that form the foundation of Judaism. The 12th principle of faith is the belief in the Messianic age that will be ushered in by Mashiach, by the Messiah. The 13th and final principle is that at some point during the Messianic age, when God so decides, the dead will be brought back to life. The soul and body will be reunited here in this physical world. That is a basic principle of faith that it's mentioned, according to one interpretation, in the book of Deuteronomy, near the end, in the parsha called Hazinu. It's also mentioned in many other biblical books, including Ezekiel, Cheskel, Yeshaya, Isaiah, Daniel, and other places as well. Now, the resurrection of the dead means literally the dead people whose bodies have long decomposed will be brought back to life. God will reconstruct the body and infuse the body with its original soul. That is a basic Jewish belief that will happen. And this is not the class and time to explore that belief. We'll do it on another occasion. However, when we thank God for having given us back our soul, it's a reminder of another restoration of a soul, a much more powerful one, a much more distant one in terms of the morning, everyday restoration of the soul, that God, just as He gives us back our soul every morning, though we were asleep, and sleep is a 60th of death, as I mentioned before, so too do we trust God that in the future He will also restore our soul to us and give us life again in this physical world. So that is a remote, elusive translation or interpretation of Modani, that I'm thanking God not just for waking up in the morning, but for the ultimate resurrection of the dead. Then we go to the third level, Drush, the homiletical level, which means the level in which we probe beneath the surface and we look for a lesson, we look for a message. Yes, we're thanking God that we're alive, but there's a message here. And the message is also contained in some of the words that we say in this brief prayer of Modani. The message is that we have to restore return something that was given to us in trust, regardless of whether that person owes us something or not. To use the example that is given, someone comes to you, your neighbor comes to you and says, I'm going on a vacation. I want to keep my car in your garage. Okay, fine. Now your neighbor owes you $10,000, and when he comes back and he wants his car, you say, you know what? You owe me $10,000, and you are postponing it and procrastinating, and you're not giving me the money. I'm keeping the car. It's a used car. It's worth $10,000. It's perfect. I keep the car because you didn't give me back my $10,000. Jewish law says no, you can't do that, because there's a mitzvah that when someone gives you something in trust, tells you, I'm giving it to you, I'm entrusting you with that object, that you will return it to me at the time that I come and claim it, you have that mitzvah. The fact that he owes you money is irrelevant. You want to collect the money? There are means at your disposal, legal means. Take him to court. Do whatever you have to do legally to get the money from him. But don't deny him the object that you are guarding, which you have a mitzvah to do because of what he owes you. How do we get that message from the Modeh Ani? Very simply. God is the one in whom we entrust our soul at night. There's an expression we say in the prayer that we recite before going to bed. Biyadcha afkid ruchi. In your hands I deposit my spirit. Afkid, my life. Afkid is the same word, the same root as the word for an article that given in trust for someone to guard. So we are telling God, we're giving you our soul. You are now a guard. And God follows his own commandments, and he returns it to us, though we might owe him something, for which he might be entitled to withhold our soul because we owe him. And God doesn't do that. He gives us back our soul even when we owe him. He doesn't say, you owe me, I'm not giving you back your soul. So here is a meaning. We're not looking for a remote application of waking up in the morning to something else. We're seeing the underlying message that we're grateful to God that he doesn't withhold our soul. So too, we have to learn the ethical approach of not withholding something given to us. That's the third level. Then we get to the sod, to the mystical level. And here we have to use a little bit of concentration, and we have to look at things in a different way than we normally see things. In the Modeh Ani, we refer to God not by name, but as the living king, which is problematic at first glance because obviously God is living. So why do we say the living king? We should just say, I gratefully thank you, the king, for having restored my soul to me. If you don't want to say God, we use the word king instead. That would have been enough. Why living king? So the Kabbalists, the authors of Kabbalah, say that this is a reference to a process, a mystical process that occurs when our soul comes back in our body. There are two different forms of life forces. There's the life force within us that is called Chai Lahachios, life to give life. Life that is intended to animate something else. You plug something into the wall, there's energy, electricity that fits into that appliance and gives it life. That's a lower level of life. Then there's what we call Chai Be'etzem, essential life. Life that is not regulated and attenuated to our own capacity. It's essential life. It's transcendent life. There are certain people whose only life they have is life that animates them. They don't have this essential life. That's why it talks about one of the great leaders in the times of King David, Benayahu ben Yehoyada ben Ishchai. He was a living person. And the question is asked in the Talmud, isn't everyone a living person? But no, he had a different type of life. His life, even when he was physically alive, was essential life, was life that transcends the life that we have just by virtue of our functioning as a human being. And a righteous person, therefore, it says in the Talmud, even when he dies, he's alive. Because his life was never just measured by his activities, by his functioning. The life was an essential life. Well, God, too, has two dimensions of life. There is the attribute of Malchus. There are 10 attributes of God. The lowest is called Malchus, God as a king. What is the definition of a king? It's a metaphor for God, obviously. A king has subjects. It means if you're a king, you have to have people over whom you're king, people who you control, people who you provide for, leadership, sustenance, and so on. So when we talk about God as a king, we're talking about that aspect of godly energy that relates to the creation, that is regulated, that is in many ways limited, so it can deal with finite beings. That's a lower level of godly energy. Then there's a higher level of godly energy where we say Melech Chai, he's a living God. That means God also has a transcendent aspect of energy, and that corresponds to the attribute of Yesod, which means foundation, but actually it refers to the higher attributes before they are manifested within the lower level of Malchus. Putting that in simple terms, it means that we could be alive but not be fully alive. Modani means we're grateful to God for synthesizing and channeling the essential life, Chai, through Melech, through the power of Malchus, of sovereignty, of kingship, which channels everything into our existence. So the gratitude to God is that we're not just limited beings, we have the potential to be unlimited, to express the unlimited power of God. And that we can do that only when the soul is back in the body, because only then can we fulfill God's will by studying Torah and doing the mitzvahs. When we do that, we're in touch with a higher form of godly life, not just the same energy that animates every other creature on earth. So the mystical teaching over here is that we're grateful to God for the ability to live a much higher, a much nobler life that we couldn't do without the soul being in the body. So here we have 4 interpretations. Pshat, the simple one, means God, thank you that we are alive. Thank you that you gave us back our soul. Number 2, the remez, the hint. Thank you, God, that just as you are kind to us and you gave us back our soul now, you will do so in the future on a higher and greater magnitude. You will restore our souls to our dead bodies in the Messianic age. Number 3, the drush, the homiletical approach, is that we learned from God's returning our soul to us, which we gave him in trust, in spite of the fact that we may owe him something and he could always withhold it because of that, and he doesn't. So too, we should never withhold anything from someone that we owe just because that person may owe us something from before. We always give it back to that person. And fourthly, the son, the mystical level, is that we're thanking God for more than just being alive, but from having the 2 attributes of God, Melech, the immanence of God, where God relates to us on our level, and Chai, where God gives us essential life, a transcendent life. We're grateful for that opportunity that we have once we wake up. Then there's a 5th approach, the Hasidic approach. Without going into much detail, the Rebbe, in his landmark discourse on the essence of Hasidus, explains that Hasidic teaching gets to the very essence of Torah, the 5th level. It's the quintessence of the Torah. It's the part of Torah that sheds light on all the other parts. And I'm not going to go into all the details of the Rebbe. It's a whole book. Just one major point there. The Hasidic interpretation of Modani is, on the surface, it seems Modani is an inferior prayer. It's a prayer that we can only say without mentioning God's name because we're not pure, our hands are impure. But Chassidus says that it's the opposite. The reason why God's name doesn't appear, because Modani expresses our gratitude that comes from the very essence of our existence, from the level of our soul that is called Yechida. It's the unique aspect of our soul that no matter how much we may contaminate ourselves, no matter how much we may sully our soul by all sorts of negative behavior, no matter how impure a Jew can become, there's a certain essence, the core of his or her being, known as the Yechida, that can never be contaminated. That is the Modani of the Jew. And when we say Modani, what we're doing is we're expressing our essence, because we can't express our intellect. As soon as you wake up in the morning, I don't know about you, but I know myself, if someone would ask me a difficult question, I would have to say, wait, I just woke up. Your mind isn't functioning at full capacity or even half capacity. Your emotions are still very much dormant. You can't really express your full emotions. If someone would tell you good news or, God forbid, bad news, your reaction will not be the same because you're still half asleep. So your faculties are still very much affected by the sleep, and you haven't gotten out of that. So what part of you is awake? There's one part. That's your essence. That's your core that you're expressing to God, and you're saying to God, I am giving over, I'm connecting my essence to which part of God? Not God's attributes, not his outer manifestation, to God's very essence. The Rebbe added in one of his last talks that we heard from him to date, and that is that there's even a higher level. The fact that we can express ourselves with speech points to the fact that it's still not our essence. Relative to the other faculties, it's our essence. But relative to the essence, just waking up and being aware of God, that is really the highest moment in our day. We might think it's the lowest moment because we're not even fully awake and we're not functioning and our hands are unclean. No, that's the highest moment because that's the most unsullied part of our being. Our essence of our soul is coming out and connecting to God's essence. Another thing about Moda'ani, we're thanking God for being alive, and we use the word for having restored my soul. Well, what do we think? God is going to give us my neighbor's soul? So the answer is that even though we appreciate all life and we value life, whether it's Jewish life, whether it's non-Jewish life, we even value the lives of other creatures. Judaism has always been very friendly to animals and treating animals with dignity, if you will. I don't know if dignity is the right word, but without hurting an animal. So we even ripping off a blade of grass or a leaf from a tree wantonly is something that we don't do because we appreciate all forms of life, certainly human life. But when we thank God in the morning as Jews, we have to be aware and appreciate the fact that we have a Jewish soul. That means we have the potential to fulfill a special mission that was given to us by God beyond the mission that every human being has. And this is, again, a subject for another discussion, but I think I should mention very briefly that the Jewish people were chosen to assume a much greater, more intense role in bringing godliness into this physical world. And because of the more intense role that we have, an obligation that we must have the requisite energy and potential to fulfill it. Hence, the Jewish soul is an energized soul that gives us greater depth, greater spiritual depth. And of course, no one is excluded from this. If anyone who is not Jewish wants to have that additional soul, they can always convert if they're sincere about it and they really want the additional obligations, the additional liabilities, and so on and so forth. But that I'd like to reserve for another time. So we're thanking God. God, we appreciate not just that you restored our life, but you gave us my soul. You gave us this Jewish soul. I'm thrilled that I am a Jew. Then we say with mercy, or as this translation puts it, compassionately, for having compassionately restored my soul. Now in Hebrew, there are two words for compassion. Chemla, which is the word used here, and we also have a word, rachamim. Both words are translated the same, compassion, mercy. But the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, in one of his discourses, explains the difference. Compassion you have on a stranger. If you see a beggar in the street, looks like he's not have a, he didn't have a decent meal in days, doesn't have a place to sleep, and you have pity on him and compassion, and you give him something, you buy him a sandwich, you give him a place to live. He's a total stranger to you, but just the heart of a decent person goes out to that person, and you show compassion. Chemla is the compassion to something close to you. That's a much deeper type of feeling because you have something invested in it. When our soul leaves this world and we get it back, we recognize the great compassion that God did because of God's closeness to the soul and our closeness to the soul. We're not talking about a strange beggar, metaphorically speaking. We're talking about an intimate part of us. So our feelings are much more pronounced, much deeper. Then at the end, we say, "Great is your faithfulness." That simply means that when we see how faithful you are in bringing back our soul to us, we only can exclaim, "You're faithful. We can trust you, God." If we cannot put trust in you, we cannot put trust in anyone else. Now, human beings are strange creatures because we put trust in banks. They used to call banks trust companies. We put trust in insurance companies. We put trust in every institution that has failed us time and again. Yet, the one thing that we should put our trust in, God, we sometimes waver about that. But God is the ultimately only thing we can trust. I remember a Holocaust survivor, Sam Friedman, was asked by students, how is it that he lived through the Holocaust, he went through Auschwitz, and he never lost faith and trust in God? How could he? And he said, very simply, he said, who was there to trust? What was there to trust? Was there any institution that you could trust? Were there any countries in the world that you can trust? Alas, you couldn't trust the Allies for doing anything to save Jews. Unfortunately and tragically, even our country didn't do very much to save Jews. You couldn't trust institutions, you couldn't trust countries, you couldn't trust other people. You never knew who was going to take you and help you. There were many individuals who did save Jews, but did you have trust that they're going to do it? Sometimes your best friend, your neighbor, would see a Jew hiding from the Nazis, and he would inform the German authorities that there's a Jew hiding here to be executed. Sometimes they did it with their own bare hands. Neighbors would take weapons in their hand to kill their own best friends and neighbors during the Holocaust. Could you trust anyone? The only one you could put your trust in was God. Otherwise, there's nothing in life worth living. So that was his way of recognizing that God is the one to be trusted. Thank God we don't have to lose our faith in everything else to have faith in God. But we have to know that there's no reason to trust anything intrinsically except for God. And that's what we're reminded of every morning. We wake up in the morning, we say, God, we trust you. Great is your faithfulness. You're faithful. You bring us life every day. And then on the deeper level, and I already referred to that before, we're saying that just as you take us and you're faithful to us now by restoring our soul to us, so too we have faith and trust in you that you will do it again on a much larger scale, that you will bring back our souls to our bodies, the bodies of all those who preceded us who are no longer here in the future Messianic age. That we have such faith and trust in you, not just for tomorrow morning, but for the entire future to the end of days. Thank you very much, and God willing, we'll continue next week with the next prayer that we recite in the morning.